Perfect. Great. Thank you so much for your patience, guys. Last but not the least, we had the same topic as how can blockchain and cryptocurrencies be used to advance carbon removal solutions. It's definitely a rabbit hole. We went off in multiple directions and we came back with some very interesting points. But I think something that really hit us very early on in our conversations was the naysayers, where everybody came back to us very strongly in saying, you know what, Bitcoin and proof of work chains themselves are a huge energy sink and they have a huge CO2 footprint. And we also found answers to this particular question or this sort of point in terms of proof of stake and different solutions on layer two or parachains. Now, these are essentially different ways of confirming the same blockchain process or structure or algorithm, as one may call it, in order to maintain the sanctity of the trust. And these would potentially have lower footprints. We also came across, various interpretations and suggestions in terms of renewables being used to power blockchain. And I think the last one was a volcano being suggested in South America, right? So we've had all those sorts of solutions being presented, but there's definitely work happening out there. The second huge pushback we received was that blockchain is a distraction, and this is a very pertinent point in the sense that most people came back asking, why is it necessary to have this complex proof of stake or proof of work? Why not just simply use a database? And I think to this particular point, we were pretty clear in our understanding, and I think we could does provide trust and trust us uh, offer that benefit. It also added the added benefit of holding all data in trust, in the sense, that no one body controlling data. So think AWS, controlling everybody's data. I'm just using that as a placeholder. But in when your data is on the blockchain, then it's not really being controlled by a central authority. And I'm speaking of a particular type of blockchain, the permissionless blockchain. And lastly, and I think this is where we really struggled with, we had a massive pushback on the points that blockchain and cryptocurrencies have a huge UI and UX issue. And this we were forced to agree and confront that yes, that's really a big problem. Until we get over this, scaling up is going to be an issue. The other point that really came up was, that blockchain or trust uh, is all happening on chain, whereas CO2 removal is actually a physical reality, and CO2 removal happens off chain. However, to this particular point, we came up on work being done on the measurement, reporting, and verification part that could be done using, for example, IoT devices or automated capture using devices, such that this information could be stored on chain to account for the carbon sequestration. So we saw use cases around that also. So then, what does really blockchain do? I mean, what's all of this hoo-ha about, right? So we came across some very interesting use cases. And again, this is what we did. We went off in all directions and we came across various solutions offering, for example, blockchain facilitating the governance function, where we had, a DAO, and this DAO not just gave control to all the participants, but in fact allowed the end users also to have a say in how the project really functioned over a long term. What we call stewardship in climate change could in fact be enabled by a DAO. We, of course, had the low hanging fruit of the funding and finance of tokenization. We came across models who are doing that. We came across some interesting happenstances called hybrid contract, wherein this particular problem of off-chain and on-chain was actually being solved by a hybrid contract, for example, Chainlink 2, which was capturing data, in a sense, operationalizing the entire carbon sequestration part. We then came across validation of carbon offsets. The another interesting consumer engagement we came across was, taking this to the end consumer. So we came across projects which were involving end users. For example, Green Deeds of Smart Village, involving end users in this entire process. And I think that is sort of the missing part of the entire climate change narrative, where the end user or the consumer is not really participating in this conversation. The moment you have the end user or consumer there, scaling is definitely possible. We then also found, a huge important part of this conversation in the sense of supporting ecosystems being developed. For example, climate data being captured by devices and then being sold on marketplaces and being enabled by smart contracts and the blockchain. And of course, lastly, we have the circular economy and the NFT bits really kicking in. So as one can see, blockchain does facilitate a huge number of functions. I will now pass on to Alex. Alex?
Thank you, Pranav, for laying the groundwork there. So in the 3 weeks, I was looking into the distributed stakeholder influence on carbon dioxide removal solutions, especially in soil carbon removal. And so I'll walk through some of the aspects that these proof of stake blockchains can unleash for us in order to tackle climate change through carbon dioxide removal. But that being said, there's still a lot of data to be released and first captured and released to the community to understand some baselines in different parts of the world to control for additionality. So primarily we need to educate the public on soil health, and that should pave the way for further applications. Next slide, please. So like I was mentioning, quantifying carbon is still hard. I popped into this slide some of the different claims: 100-year permanence, 40-year permanence. We have to know about land tenure in order to guarantee these things. So blockchain could facilitate some of these guarantees on carbon supply, project availability. So this is from the previous climate sprint on the supply cost curve. So we still have to deal with permanence. How are different parties rewarded? These things can be controlled for using a DAO, but we still have to get the user, understand user perspective, especially from farmers and service providers. Next slide, please. To talk a little bit more about proof of stake, what that looks like generally, instead of having a computer mine for coins, unique coins, you have stake. So everybody has some stake in this project, and they can put it on the chain on a validator node. This is my layman understanding of this. So imagine all those circles are validator nodes. And when they agree on a new block, and that block can be a data or transaction, that block goes on the chain. And so generally, if you have a majority of stake on the chain, you can validate blocks. So that's important to secure the network, and it's more efficient and environmentally friendly. Next slide. So Region Network, in their white paper, you'll see how they have community stake built into their system. They have a hybrid stake consortium model, and they're restricting voting power. So blockchain is being used as this voting mechanism as well to get these outcomes. Next slide. Again, from the white paper, this is a rough diagram of how the data flows in, how it's computed, how the funding organizations are using it, running the protocols on this data, going onto the ledger. You'll see smart contracts on the side there, something it might be aside from the chain. And so you have data flowing to the land stewards as well, and rewards flowing all through the blockchain as this sort of secure network. Next slide. So some final thoughts is kind of like, what if these various farm service providers could offer these low carbon farming solutions? We've seen some startups on the ground in India offering rental equipment through mobile phone access, data through mobile phone. There's also crop insurance running through crypto, as you see with Arbol down there. There's a ton to learn about, and I think all these technologies will converge to get better soil health, but how fast and at what scale is still to be determined. Thank you.
Great.
Hi,
We'll have Shalini. Yeah, please, Shalini. Sorry.
Hi, guys. So we've had a lot of great conversations with different companies during our 3-week sprint, and we've kind of summarized what we learned from 2 separate organizations. So these organizations do have, I guess, a crypto system for carbon credit. So the first system, or the first organization we looked at, was Moss. So Moss.Earth is a company that's situated in Brazil, mostly is their HQ, and basically they provide carbon credit to preserve the Amazon rainforest. And the second company that we looked at, next slide, is the IBM Energy Blockchain. So that is here for most part in the United States, and apparently Procter and Gamble, one of the biggest conglomerates in the United States, has put themselves on this blockchain to kind of meet their sustainable quota, so to speak. So we summarized some of our learnings from our conversations with them. So in the next slide, so what we learned, next slide, what we learned that both of them, basically they want to bridge the data gap between economy and finance. In terms of the actual crypto system and building the blockchain system, which the other team talked about in great lengths, which is also something we looked into, but their system seems like the transactions are transparent, it's traceable, and it's visible to all stakeholders. And apparently they have about 300 methods in which you can actually reduce your or meet your carbon quota, and these are translated into contracts that you can use. So basically, but however, even though they've been able to get a lot of people on their system, the biggest issue they had was a lot of people that didn't want to get on their system because they didn't want their, I guess they didn't want this so transparent. So what they discussed was that we need more global policies, and policies that are more global and also local, where it becomes a mandate to actually get on these, sorry, next slide. It becomes a mandate to actually get on these systems where, we can actually trace and see which corporations are actually, I guess, responsible for their carbon footprint. So also these systems are looking into e-vehicles, and also a power trading ledger. So they're, in terms of technology, I think they are probably the go-to people, or people who've been building the solution for several years. So they have actually broke through a lot of limitations, but what they're coming up against is that a lot of people are not interested in going on that system because they do not want their, I guess, carbon footprint as transparent. So I guess they don't want to be accountable. Next slide.
Yeah.
So I guess these are kind of the barriers, and what we learned from these systems that have actually broke through some of the technical limitations is that we need policy where people need to make their carbon footprint more, they need to be accountable for their carbon footprint. So that's kind of what we got out of these conversations. And over to Pranav.
Yep. So I got the opportunity to speak to B Climate. They are creating a marketplace on collating data around climate and offering it on the blockchain to green deeds who are participating in a project called Region NFT, wherein they are creating NFTs for community farms, and also a couple of other people, including Josh. So what really jumped out for me specifically was the perspective that blockchain provides trust in a trustless environment, and the fact that there is a lot of data out there, and it is just too dangerous just to leave it in the hands of specific governments who might have agendas, or specific agencies who might have agenda. So a smart contract, or the blockchain, or the DAO, which is essentially governed by the community, by the holders of the participants in the system. So that would be the most appropriate. The other bit that really jumped out at me was that there is a fat tail of users and using blockchain, there can be the economies of scale. And by that, I'm using a specific example in terms of currently working with Green Deeds on this particular project of Region NFT, wherein we would want to create a POC of the economics of this particular model of creating an NFT and what are the costs and of implementing it and so on and so forth in terms of capturing data to creating the NFT at a community garden level. And this being done, we would want to do this as a POC at a small farm holding in India. So, assuming things fall into place, we have some data points around whether this can be scaled up and what are the sort of the economics of the model. The way forward for the group, I think what really struck us or what came out was there is this gap in terms of the literacy aspect, and not just in terms of the carbon literacy, but also of the crypto literacy, but especially of how both of these fields are engaging or interacting. So that is something that, as a whole, for all of us, we need to bring ourselves up to speed on, because technology is moving at a quick clip, and there are opportunities to be had out there. The other bit, as Shalini mentioned, is that there is a very specific point around policy incentives that need to be put into place by the governments in order to ensure that even when the when the technologies are available, their companies or corporates are incentivized to participate. And lastly, and I think this is probably the most important one, the ease of use for blockchain has to be put into place. We definitely think there is a huge gap in terms of the design element to enable scaling. And yeah, we stop here. Thank you.